双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Darwin and Modern Science by A.C. Seward. Essays in commemoration of the centenary of the birth of Charles Darwin and of the 50th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. My success as a man of science, whatever this may have amounted to, has been determined, as far as I can judge, by complex and diversified mental qualities and conditions. Of these, the most important have been the love of science, unbounded patience in long reflecting over any subject, industry in observing and collecting facts, and a fair share of invention, as well as of common sense. With such moderate abilities as I possess, it is truly surprising that I should have influenced to a considerable extent the belief of scientific men on some important points. Autobiography, 1881. The Life and Letters of Charles Darwin.
Vol. I.
Page 107. Preface. At the suggestion of the Cambridge Philosophical Society, the syndics of the University Press decided in March 1908 to arrange for the publication of a series of essays in commemoration of the centenary of the birth of Charles Darwin and of the 50th anniversary of the publication of The Origin of Species. The preliminary arrangements were made by a committee consisting of the following representatives of the Council of the Philosophical Society and of the Press Syndicate: Dr. H.K. Anderson, Professor Bateson, Mr. Francis Darwin, Dr. Hobson, Dr. Marr, Professor Sedgwick, Mr. David Sharp, Mr. Shipley, Professor Sorley, Professor Seward. In the course of the preparation of the volume, the original scheme and list of authors have been modified. A few of those invited to contribute essays were, for various reasons, unable to do so, and some alterations have been made in the titles of articles. For the selection of authors and for the choice of subjects, the committee are mainly responsible, but for such share of the work in the preparation of the volume as usually falls to the lot of an editor, I accept full responsibility. Authors were asked to address themselves primarily to the educated layman rather than to the expert. It was hoped that the publication of the essays would serve the double purpose of illustrating the far-reaching influence of Darwin's work on the progress of knowledge and the present attitude of original investigators and thinkers towards the views embodied in Darwin's works. In regard to the interpretation of a passage in The Origin of Species quoted by Hugo de Vries, it seemed advisable to add an editorial footnote. But, with this exception, I have not felt it necessary to record any opinion on views stated in the essays. In reading the essays in proof, I have availed myself freely of the willing assistance of several Cambridge friends, among whom I wish more especially to thank Mr. Francis Darwin for the active interest he has taken in the preparation of the volume. Mrs. J. Thompson kindly undertook the translation of the essays by Professor Weissman and Professor Schwalbe. Mrs. James Ward was good enough to assist me by translating Professor Buggle's article on sociology. And to Mr. McCabe I am indebted for the translation of the essay by Professor Haeckel. For the translation of the botanical articles by Professor Goebel, Professor Klebs, and Professor Strasburger, I am responsible. In the revision of the translation of Professor Strasburger's essay, Madame Herrera of Brussels rendered valuable help. Mr. Wright, the Secretary of the Press Syndicate, and Mr. Waller, the Assistant Secretary, have cordially cooperated with me in my editorial work. Nor can I omit to thank the readers of the University Press for keeping watchful eyes on my shortcomings in the correction of proofs. The two portraits of Darwin are reproduced by permission of Messrs. Maule and Fox and Messrs. Elliott and Fry. The photogravure of the study at Down is reproduced from an etching by Mr. Axel Haig, lent by Mr. Francis Darwin. The colored plate illustrating Professor Weissman's essay was originally published by him in his Vortrage über Descendenztheorie, which afterwards appeared, 1904, in English under the title, The Evolution Theory. Copies of this plate were supplied by Messrs. Fisher of Jena. The syndics of the University Press have agreed, in the event of this volume being a financial success, to hand over the profits to a university fund for the endowment of biological research. It is clearly impossible to express adequately in a single volume of essays the influence of Darwin's contributions to knowledge on the subsequent progress of scientific inquiry. As Huxley said in 1885, "Whatever be the ultimate verdict of posterity upon this or that opinion which Mr. Darwin has propounded, whatever adumbrations or anticipations of his doctrines may be found in the writings of his predecessors, the broad fact remains that, since the publication, and by reason of the publication of The Origin of Species, the fundamental conceptions and the aims of the students of living nature have been completely changed, but the impulse thus given to scientific thought rapidly spread beyond the ordinarily recognized limits of biology. Psychology, ethics, cosmology were stirred to their foundations, and The Origin of Species proved itself to be the fixed point which the general doctrine needed in order to move the world." In the contributions to this memorial volume, some of the authors have more especially concerned themselves with the results achieved by Darwin's own work, while others pass in review the progress of research on lines which, though unknown or but little followed in his day, are the direct outcome of his work. The divergence of views among biologists in regard to the origin of species and as to the most promising directions in which to seek for truth is illustrated by the different opinions of contributors. Whether Darwin's views on the modus operandi of evolutionary forces receive further confirmation in the future, or whether they are materially modified, in no way affects the truth of the statement that, by employing his life in adding a little to natural science, he revolutionized the world of thought. Darwin wrote in 1872 to Alfred Russel Wallace, "How grand is the onward rush of science! It is enough to console us for the many errors which we have committed, and for our efforts being overlaid and forgotten in the mass of new facts and new views which are daily turning up. In the onward rush, it is easy for students convinced of the correctness of their own views and equally convinced of the falsity of those of their fellow workers to forget the lessons of Darwin's life." In his autobiographical sketch, he tells us, "I have steadily endeavored to keep my mind free so as to give up any hypothesis, however much beloved, as soon as facts are shown to be opposed to it." Writing to Mr. J. Scott, he says, "It is a golden rule, which I try to follow, to put every fact which is opposed to one's preconceived opinion in the strongest light. Absolute accuracy is the hardest merit to attain, and the highest merit. Any deviation is ruin." He acted strictly in accordance with his determination expressed in a letter to Lyell in 1844. "I shall keep out of controversy, and just give my own facts." As was said of another son of Cambridge, Sir George Stokes, he would no more have thought of disputing about priority, or the authorship of an idea, than of writing a report for a company promoter. Darwin's life affords a striking confirmation of the truth of Hazlitt's aphorism, "Where the pursuit of truth has been the habitual study of any man's life, the love of truth will be his ruling passion." Great as was the intellect of Darwin, his character, as Huxley wrote, was even nobler than his intellect. A.C. Seward, Botany School, Cambridge, March 20, 1909. Contents: Introductory letter to the editor from Sir Joseph Dalton Hooker. O.M.
2.
Darwin's predecessors. J. Arthur Thomson, Professor of Natural History in the University of Aberdeen. 3. The Selection Theory. August Weismann, Professor of Zoology in the University of Freiburg, Baden. 4. Variation. Hugo de Vries, Professor of Botany in the University of Amsterdam. V. Heredity and Variation in Modern Lights. W. Bateson, Professor of Biology in the University of Cambridge. 6. The Minute Structure of Cells in Relation to Heredity. Eduard Strasburger, Professor of Botany in the University of Bonn. 7. The Descent of Man. G. Schwalbe, Professor of Anatomy in the University of Strasbourg.
8.
Charles Darwin, as an anthropologist. Ernst Haeckel, Professor of Zoology in the University of Jena.
9.
Some Primitive Theories of the Origin of Man. J. G. Fraser, Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. X. The Influence of Darwin on the Study of Animal Embryology. A. Sedgwick, Professor of Zoology and Comparative Anatomy in the University of Cambridge. 11. The Paleontological Record. I. Animals. W. B. Scott, Professor of Geology in the University of Princeton. 12. The Paleontological Record.
2.
Plants. D. H. Scott, President of the Linnean Society of London. 13. The Influence of Environment on the Forms of Plants. George Klebs, Professor of Botany in the University of Heidelberg. 14. Experimental Study of the Influence of Environment on Animals. Jacques Loeb, Professor of Physiology in the University of California. 15. The Value of Color in the Struggle for Life. E. B. Poulton, Hope Professor of Zoology in the University of Oxford.
16.
Geographical Distribution of Plants. Sir William Thistleton Dyer. 17. Geographical Distribution of Animals. Hans Gadow, Strickland Curator and Lecturer on Zoology in the University of Cambridge. 18. Darwin and Geology. J. W. Judd. 19. Darwin's Work on the Movements of Plants. Francis Darwin. XX. The Biology of Flowers. K. Goebel, Professor of Botany in the University of Munich. 21. Mental Factors in Evolution. C. Lloyd Morgan, Professor of Psychology at University College, Bristol. 22. The Influence of the Conception of Evolution on Modern Philosophy. H. Hofting, Professor of Philosophy in the University of Copenhagen. 23. Darwinism and Sociology. C. Bogle, Professor of Social Philosophy in the University of Toulouse, and Deputy Professor at the Sorbonne,
Paris.
24. The Influence of Darwin upon Religious Thought. Rev. P. N. Waggett. 25. The Influence of Darwinism on the Study of Religions. Jane Ellen Harrison, Staff Lecturer and sometime Fellow of Newnham College, Cambridge. 26. Evolution and the Science of Language. P. Giles, Reader in Comparative Philology in the University of Cambridge. 27. Darwinism and History. J. B. Barry, Regius Professor of Modern History in the University of Cambridge. 28. The Genesis of Double Stars. Sir George Darwin, Plumian Professor of Astronomy and Experimental Philosophy in the University of Cambridge. 29. The Evolution of Matter. W. C. D. Wetham, Fellow of Trinity College, Cambridge. Index. Dates of the publication of Charles Darwin's books and of the principal events in his life. 1809. Charles Darwin, born at Shrewsbury, February 12.1817. At 8.5 years old, I went to Mr. Case's school, a day school at Shrewsbury kept by the Rev. G. Case, minister of the Unitarian Chapel. 1818. I was at school at Shrewsbury under a great scholar, Dr. Butler. I learned absolutely nothing, except by amusing myself by reading and experimenting in chemistry. 1825. As I was doing no good at school, my father wisely took me away at a rather earlier age than usual, and sent me, October 1825, to Edinburgh University with my brother, where I stayed for 2 years. 1828. Began residence at Christ's College, Cambridge. I went to Cambridge early in the year 1828, and soon became acquainted with Professor Henslow. Nothing could be more simple, cordial, and unpretending than the encouragement which he afforded to all young naturalists. During the 3 years which I spent at Cambridge, my time was wasted, as far as the academical studies were concerned, as completely as at Edinburgh and at school. In order to pass the B.A. examination, it was necessary to get up Paley's Evidences of Christianity and his Moral Philosophy. The careful study of these works, without attempting to learn any part by rote, was the only part of the academical course which was of the least use to me in the education of my mind. 1831. Passed the examination for the B.A. degree in January and kept the following terms. I gained a good place among the oi polloi, or crowd of men who do not go in for honors. I am very busy, and see a great deal of Henslow, whom I do not know whether I love or respect most. December 27th. Sailed from England on our circumnavigation in HMS Beagle, a bark of 235 tons carrying 6 guns, under Captain Fitzroy. There is indeed a tide in the affairs of men. 1836. October 4th. Reached Shrewsbury after absence of 5 years and 2 days. You cannot imagine how gloriously delightful my first visit was at home. It was worth the banishment. December 13th. Went to live at Cambridge, Fitzwilliam Street. The only evil I found in Cambridge was its being too pleasant. 1837. On my return home, in the Beagle, in the autumn of 1836, I immediately began to prepare my journal for publication, and then saw how many facts indicated the common descent of species. In July 1837, I opened my first notebook for facts in relation to the origin of species, about which I had long reflected, and never ceased working for the next 20 years, had been greatly struck from about the month of previous March on character of South American fossils, and species on Galapagos archipelago. These facts, especially latter. Origin of all my views. On March 7th, 1837, I took lodgings in 36 Great Marlborough Street in London, and remained there for nearly 2 years, until I was married. 1838. In October, that is 15 months after I had begun my systematic inquiry, I happened to read for amusement Malthus on population, and being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence, which everywhere goes on from long-continued observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances favorable variations would tend to be preserved, and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species. Here then I had at last got a theory by which to work, but I was so anxious to avoid prejudice that I determined not for some time to write even the briefest sketch of it. 1839. Married at Maer, Staffordshire, to his first cousin Emma Wedgwood, daughter of Josiah Wedgwood. I marvel at my good fortune that she, so infinitely my superior in every single moral quality, consented to be my wife. She has been my wise adviser and cheerful comforter throughout life, which without her would have been during a very long period a miserable one from ill health. She has earned the love of every soul near her. Autobiography. December 31st. Entered 12 Upper Gower Street, now 110 Gower Street, London. There never was so good a house for me, and I devoutly trust you, his future wife, will approve of it equally. The little garden is worth its weight in gold. Published Journal and Researches. Being Volume 3 of the Narrative of the Surveying Voyage of HMS Adventure and Beagle. Publication of the Zoology of the Voyage of HMS Beagle. Part 2. Mammalia. By G.R. Waterhouse. With a notice of their habits and ranges. By Charles Darwin. 1840. Contributed Geological Introduction to Part 1. Fossil Mammalia. Of the Zoology of the Voyage of HMS Beagle. By Richard Owen. 1842. In June 1842, I first allowed myself the satisfaction of writing a very brief abstract of my species theory in pencil in 35 pages, and this was enlarged during the summer of 1844 into one of 230 pages, which I had fairly copied out and still, 1876, possess. The first draft of The Origin of Species, edited by Mr. Francis Darwin, will be published this year, 1909, by the syndics of the Cambridge University Press.
Septembre 2014.
Settled at the village of Down in Kent. I think I was never in a more perfectly quiet country. Publication of The Structure and Distribution of Coral Reefs. Being Part 1 of the Geology of the Voyage of the Beagle. 1844. Publication of Geological Observations on the Volcanic Islands visited during the voyage of HMS Beagle. Being Part 2 of the Geology of the Voyage of the Beagle. I think much more highly of my book on volcanic islands since Mr. Judd, by far the best judge on the subject in England, has, as I hear, learnt much from it. Autobiography, 1876. 1845. Publication of the Journal of Researches as a separate book. 1846. Publication of Geological Observations on South America, being Part 3. Of the Geology of the Voyage of the Beagle. 1851. Publication of a monograph of the fossil Lepidity and of a monograph of the subclass Cirripedia. I fear the study of the Cirripedia will ever remain wholly unapplied, and yet I feel that such study is better than castle building. 1854. Publication of monographs of the Balanidae and Verrucidae. I worked steadily on this subject for 8 years, and ultimately published 2 thick volumes, describing all the known living species, and 2 thin quartos on the extinct species. My work was of considerable use to me when I had to discuss in The Origin of Species the principles of a natural classification. Nevertheless, I doubt whether the work was worth the consumption of so much time. From September 1850, I devoted my whole time to arranging my huge pile of notes, to observing, and to experimenting in relation to the transmutation of species. 1856. Early in 1856, Lyell advised me to write out my views pretty fully, and I began at once to do so on a scale 3 or 4 times as extensive as that which was afterwards followed in my Origin of Species. 1858. Joint paper by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace on the tendency of species to form varieties, and on the perpetuation of varieties and species by natural means of selection, communicated to the Linnean Society by Sir Charles Lyell and Sir Joseph Hooker. I was at first very unwilling to consent to the communication of his MS to the Society, as I thought Mr. Wallace might consider my doing so unjustifiable, for I did not then know how generous and noble was his disposition. July 20th to August 12th at Sandown, Isle of Wight, began Abstract of Species Book, 1859. November 24th. Publication of The Origin of Species, 1250 copies.
Oh,
Good heavens! The relief to my head and body to banish the whole subject from my mind.
but
Alas! How frequent, how almost universal it is in an author to persuade himself of the truth of his own dogmas. My only hope is that I certainly see many difficulties of gigantic stature. 1860. Publication of the second edition of The Origin, 3,000 copies. Publication of A Naturalist's Voyage. 1861. Publication of the third edition of The Origin, 2,000 copies. I am going to write a little book on orchids, and today I hate them worse than everything. 1862. Publication of the book on the various contrivances by which orchids are fertilized by insects. 1865. Read paper before the Linnean Society on the movements and habits of climbing plants. Published as a book in 1875, 1866. Publication of the fourth edition of The Origin, 1250 copies. 1868. I have sent the MS of my big book, and horridly, disgustingly big it will be, to the printers. Publication of the variation of animals and plants under domestication. About my book, I will give you, Sir Joseph Hooker, a bit of advice. Skip the whole of volume, except the last chapter, and that need only be skimmed, and skip largely in the second volume, and then you will say it is a very good book. Towards the end of the work, I give my well-abused hypothesis of pangenesis. An unverified hypothesis is of little or no value, but if anyone should hereafter be led to make observations by which some such hypothesis could be established, I shall have done good service, as an astonishing number of isolated facts can be thus connected together and rendered intelligible. 1869. Publication of the fifth edition of The Origin. 1871. Publication of The Descent of Man. Although in The Origin of Species the derivation of any particular species is never discussed, yet I thought it best, in order that no honorable man should accuse me of concealing my views, to add that by the work, light would be thrown on the origin of man and his history. 1872. Publication of the sixth edition of The Origin. Publication of The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, 1874. Publication of the second edition of The Descent of Man. The new edition of The Descent has turned out an awful job. It took me 10 days merely to glance over letters and reviews with criticisms and new facts. It is a devil of a job. Publication of the second edition of The Structure and Distribution of Coral Reefs, 1875. Publication of Insectivorous Plants. I begin to think that everyone who publishes a book is a fool. Publication of the second edition of Variation in Animals and Plants. Publication of The Movements and Habits of Climbing Plants as a separate book, 1876. Wrote autobiographical sketch, Life and Letters. Volume 1. Chap 2. Publication of The Effects of Cross and Self-Fertilization. I now, 1881, believe, however, that I ought to have insisted more strongly than I did on the many adaptations for self-fertilization. Publication of the second edition of Observations on Volcanic Islands, 1877. Publication of The Different Forms of Flowers on Plants of the Same Species. I do not suppose that I shall publish any more books. I cannot endure being idle. But heaven knows whether I am capable of any more good work. Publication of the second edition of The Orchid Book, 1878. Publication of the second edition of The Effects of Cross and Self-Fertilization, 1879. Publication of an English translation of Ernst Krauss's Erasmus Darwin, with a notice by Charles Darwin. I am extremely glad that you approve of the little life of our grandfather, for I have been repenting that I ever undertook it, as the work was quite beyond my tether. To Mr. Francis Galton, November 14, 1879. 1880. Publication of The Power of Movement in Plants. It has always pleased me to exalt plants in the scale of organized beings. Publication of the second edition of The Different Forms of Flowers, 1881. Wrote a continuation of the autobiography. Publication of The Formation of Vegetable Mold through the Action of Worms. It is the completion of a short paper read before the Geological Society more than 40 years ago, and has revived old geological thoughts. As far as I can judge, it will be a curious little book. 1882. Charles Darwin died at Down, April 19th, and was buried in Westminster Abbey, April 26th, in the north aisle of the nave, a few feet from the grave of Sir Isaac Newton. As for myself, I believe that I have acted rightly in steadily following and devoting my life to science. I feel no remorse from having committed any great sin, but have often and often regretted that I have not done more direct good to my fellow creatures. The quotations in the above epitome are taken from the autobiography and published letters. The Life and Letters of Charles Darwin, including an autobiographical chapter, edited by his son, Francis Darwin.
3 vols.
London, 1887. Charles Darwin. His life told in an autobiographical chapter, and in a selected series of his published letters, edited by his son, Francis Darwin. London, 1902. More Letters of Charles Darwin. A record of his work in a series of hitherto unpublished letters, edited by Francis Darwin and A.C. Seward.
2 vols.
London, 1903. Introductory letter. From Sir Joseph Dalton Hooker, O.M., GCSI, C.B.